Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neat, Plausible and Wrong, a show where we look at business psychology through the lens of neurodiversity. I'm Matthew, and as ever, I'm joined by Dr. Miriam.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, and today's topic is change resistance, which is quite a big one for me. It's one of the ones when we first kind of came up with the ideas, I was like, yeah, I want to do this one, because it's a phrase that I hear very often and have heard very often. And I think even in its kind of appropriate usage as theoretical, like backed by theory usage, it's problematic and it's overused as well. So there's all of that for me wrapped up in it. And it touches on a whole load of stuff around neurodiversity and power and all of the really interesting stuff. So I'm really looking forward to this one. How about you?
Yeah, I really have been looking forward to this topic. And for me, there are a few things that happen when I hear change resistance, because change itself, I very much think is important and relevant and necessary. But when I hear change resistance, I also know that change resistance is also relevant and important. So it may sound like I'm contradicted in that sense, but I'm actually not. Because when I hear the word change resistant, I don't think about it as stubbornness as such, but as something far more complex than what meets the eye. So yes, I've been very looking forward to this topic.
Absolutely. I feel it's one of those things one of those phrases that's used to dismiss legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's just change resistance.
Very much so. Very much so. And it almost gives a rubber stamp to things being done a particular way, because otherwise, if you didn't, you would be going along with change resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear on what we mean, it's this idea that is very often used by employees and those in authority when employees, people subject to their authority, are resistant to the kind of organizational change or changes that are being made as part of whatever plan is happening, and that they can either passively resist by just not doing it, or they actively resist by kind of going against those changes, and that those are the kind of manifestations of change resistance. So does that sound like a fair summary to you? How do you see it? How is it used?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair summary. And if we look at the psychology behind change resistance, that's the brain's natural protective response to uncertainty, to loss of control, to cognitive overload, those sort of things. And yes, indeed, in places where it's used, you summarize that neatly.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to get into a bit more of what actually underlies it, what we're really talking about. And I think as a concept, as a psychological concept, it is clear that humans, just like any other animal, actually, are averse to unfamiliar circumstances. You know, we are. There's good evolutionary reasons to avoid unfamiliar circumstances and stick with familiar circumstances. And that can be true even when those unfamiliar circumstances might be better. You know, we have a really deep-seated response to the unfamiliar to avoid it. So it's true that it is possible that someone might offer us a better way of doing things, a better way of being, a better experience, and we might resist it just out of that aversion to the unfamiliar. However, the extent to which, and I think that's probably the most positive conception of change resistance that I can come up with, as from a theoretical, from a kind of psychological perspective. Does that fit with, like, if we're being as absolutely generous to the concept as possible, before we get into the flaws. Does that fit with how you understand it?
I think so. I think because our brains like patterns, if there is that change, the change will break the pattern that is familiar to us. So I would agree with you very much in terms of how we like the unfamiliar, and anything unfamiliar feels like a threat, activates the threat system in us, where we feel unsafe.
Yeah, and I think it is that pervasive unsafety that is the explanation. And so if we start to get into how change resistance really manifests instead, how do we actually see this as a concept showing up? What are the things that are really going on that are sometimes attributed to change resistance?
I think there are quite a few. Fear of the unknown, perhaps. Maybe loss of control, where change is not a collaboration or a collaborative kind of plan, where it's not co-created with those people that are going to be acting out the change. They might also be a threat to your competency, your identity, what you saw as your identity, where you may feel less capable because of what you used to know and what you had put in place no longer being there. I'm also thinking about systemic and cultural inertia, where organizations have habits, not just people. So there might be also that. And thinking specifically about neurodivergent individuals, routine, structure, predictability, coping systems. When change comes, all this is destabilized, and it can also be destabilizing, which makes change inconvenient. And therefore, people might find these as some of the reasons to resist change.
Yeah, I think this gets to the heart of why I find it a problematic concept, is that when we say change resistance, we are making the assumption that it is a mistake on behalf of the person. We're assuming that the change is positive for that individual rather than a negative, or doesn't represent a threat in all sorts of different ways. And we're assuming that the individual is resourced and prepared, and very much that the incentives are aligned with the person who's pushing through the change from above, which I think is one of the core blind spots in the concept and in the way it's very often applied, is to understand that whilst change might clearly be of benefit to someone at the top of the organization whose bonus is dependent upon the outcomes of that change, it might have very significant negative responses for certain people in certain situations, whether those are the kind of environmental situations or their internal disposition or a combination of those two things, that are going to experience very significant disbenefits from the change. And I like what you touched upon around, that change can be a threat to our autonomy and to our competence. And it can be, and if we have, and particularly if we're neurodivergent and we've built up a whole load of support mechanisms and ways of doing things, change is very unlikely to account for our particularly unique ways of doing things, and is very likely to break all of the support stuff and the things we've spent ages refining and making work. And I know this from my own experience. So I have quite a high novelty seeking trait. So I really like novelty and exploration. So I actually quite like quite a lot of what comes with change. But I also know that it can be very disruptive to my ability to actually get stuff done. And I think it's that there's an interesting tension there in that, like the idea of my own experience runs contrary to the idea of change resistance. It's that I actually like change, but it causes practical problems. I probably shouldn't like change as much as I do.
Yeah. It's interesting that you touched on all that, which just reminds me of the potential cognitive overload as well. When too many changes are done too quickly without people understanding the why behind it and the how it's going to work and how it's going to be different, which can overwhelm working memory and executive functioning. Therefore, what you then see is again what appears as resistance to the change.
Yeah, that legitimate, like, this doesn't work. We haven't had time to work out how this works, to adapt to a new context.
Yeah.
To even and you're right. I think, one of the really big issues I see when people are saying that there is change resistance is that they've failed to give adequate context. Quite often because they're afraid of giving adequate context. I think there's an interesting one there because either because they don't trust the people who they're claiming are change resistant, or because there is some obfuscation of outcomes, and what is ascribed to change resistance is actually an appropriate response, because it's like, if you tell people everything, then they'll realize that this isn't in their interests.
Yeah, there is that. And I'm also thinking sometimes people who bring the changes to the people may also not even understand what that is about.
That's very true.
Therefore, they wouldn't be able to explain something that they don't understand themselves, or maybe something they don't agree with. Yeah.
And I think particularly for autistic people, that lack of context can be incredibly difficult. This is one of the areas I find with and it is an important aspect of, particularly in a professional setting, is that need for verbal context, that need for understanding the context that we're operating in, and that if you have a large amount of change, understanding that you're taking away a lot of context and a lot of established contextual information, and that can make it very, very difficult for some people to know how to operate. And for all neurodivergent people, for anyone who's doing things differently to the standard way, that context helps inform our way of coming up with our own solutions. So if you've got a lack of context, it's much harder to understand, well, what does a functional solution look like if the one I'm presented with, that as part of the standard change program, doesn't work, which in all likelihood it won't for me.
Which also brings in something else, potential failure in view of past failures. For example, when you have witnessed changes causing failures and not even working as well as what used to be in place, are people going to own up to those failures, to the mistakes of the past, to say, we tried a change before, it didn't work, this is going to be like this time, and this is how we are going to make it different, to gain people's trust, to get the buy-in, to also have people get that know-how, explain the why behind the what.
Yeah, I feel like there can be a real knee-jerk reaction when change is perceived, when a change is perceived as not working, to then change things again before doing a retrospective and understanding why. And that can pull you further out of context, and you be more unanchored. And it can also mean, because I'm a big believer in experimentalism and trying things out. I absolutely don't. This is, as I say, I like change, and I think it's really important to proactively change instead of ending up the subject of external change and only reacting to that. At an organizational level, that's a vital organizational competence. But if we just change for change's sake, or change because the last one didn't work and we haven't figured out why, we end up more and more lost. We become more and more chaotic. We kind of lose any traction that we did have, and we reduce our chances of being able to get that again in the future.
And as you may also know, some of the change is not change because we want things to be better, or because those up there want things to be better. Someone wants to put their rubber stamp on what they are doing, which links in with what you said about bonuses, perhaps.
Yeah, it's understanding those set of incentives, and there's a very common habit of new senior people to change things just because it justifies their position.
Their
It
existence.
justifies their existence.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. Again, if we're not anchored in like a real assessment of the situation, waiting and understanding the system before you start tinkering with the system, or having a sense, at least having a sense of the system. You probably not even be able to have complete understanding of the system, but you should at least have a feel for it before you start experimenting, because otherwise you're not really experimenting, you're just kind of prodding it, which is a different thing.
Yeah. And besides having a feel of what something might look like, I think it's also important to anticipate what might not go so well and have some potential solutions. If things were to not go so well, what could be done?
Yeah, and I feel for me, this is again part of the experimentalism, is actually one of the issues with certain sorts of change is that it introduces uncertainty as opposed to risk. And this is a really important distinction, because risk is bounded. Risk is like odds at the casino. It's like you put this down, you might get this, or you might lose that. Uncertainty is unbounded. And the more unbounded it is, the more of a threat it potentially represents, the more threat there is in the space of possibility. And I think when we're introducing change, we want to be very, very careful to boundary this stuff so that we know we've intentionally chosen, okay, we know we're changing a complex system, we're making change in a business, it affects people, it affects customers, it affects everything. We can't fully predict results, but what we want to do is we'll put this much at stake to find out.
Yeah.
And we'll know what good looks like, and we'll know what not good looks like, so we can roll back if it doesn't work. And I think all of that level of intentionality, that level of context, is something that's very, very often missing. And if you can communicate that, there's very little to be resistant about. I think there's very little actually, it addresses so many of the issues that we've been talking about. And but those are, if you can't answer those questions, if you can't really articulate that in your domain, you're engaging with something uncertain, and therefore you're engaging with something with very significant potential downsides that you haven't fully understood and haven't fully been able to engage with. And of course, that would make people worried. That should make people worried.
Especially when you look at how certain neurodivergent brains work. With ADHD, you go in so many different directions and you cover so many domains. And if you happen to be both autistic and have ADHD, not only are you being expansive about the directions in which you're going, you are seeing different patterns in the potential outcomes. You are then going deeper into each of those to see what could be done differently. So if you don't see this as part of the change that is being suggested, you start to wonder, was this ever thought about in a more realistic way, in a way that's deep enough, in a way that would have considered all these other potential pitfalls?
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a sensitivity there, and there's also a sensitivity on another side. And I wonder whether this is also a part of what sometimes gets attributed to change resistance, in the sense that we might perceive a need for change that isn't perceived in the wider organization. Very often that capacity that you've described means seeing through opportunities and threats that aren't seen from a more conventional perspective. And because of that, then it's so often the experience in an organization, if you're neurodivergent, that you're seeing great opportunities that we just forget, that you can't convince anyone else to move towards, and huge threats that we just blunder into because despite all your warnings, you couldn't get anyone to listen. And so I think there's also something around, and then you change for something that doesn't feel like a strong signal of change, doesn't feel like a strong reason to change, it can be like, well, what does it take? So there's also a question around like what, because we know change is costly, and the goal of change is to spend some resources so we use fewer resources or become more effective later on. So that's it's like there's an energy hump. That's the purpose of committing to change. We want to spend the energy now so we're in a better position later on. But if we're doing that for things with very little payoff, when we see things with much higher payoff, it can also seem like a very strange thing to be doing. And it can make us question why this change would be happening in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how can we still, is there anything we can take from this idea of change resistance and use, or how can we go forward from here practically?
Yeah, I think going forward, my brain is stuck at the theories of change and why they are wrong. Yeah, especially in what they do before we look at what can we take forward, because some of the theories have a lot of weight, but the assumption that change is linear, I think that's one of the pitfalls of some of these theories, for example, Cotta's or Adker or Lewin's. So there's also almost ignoring the emotional realities of change, as if knowing equates wanting. But knowing a change is happening doesn't emotionally prepare people for it. Over-reliance, I think you mentioned something like that earlier, over-reliance on the leader's charisma or abilities, and ignoring, of course, neurodivergence. So in terms of what can be taken from all this, I think resistance, what I'm thinking about is what can we take from resistance? Resistance for me is not a roadblock. It is data. It is a mirror that is being held to those that are looking to effect the change, to show them what's wrong with the change process.
I love that. I think that's such a helpful reframing, is to think about it as information, resistance as feedback, and to understand that you might well be getting feedback from people who are sensitive to aspects of change, important aspects of the change that you might not be aware of. And that's true for everyone. This is one of the core features of neurodiversity as opposed to neurodivergence, is that we're all aware of different things. Or some things present themselves as huge flashing things in front of us, to us, and are completely invisible to other people, and vice versa. So I think that idea of like, how can we get the most information, and if we encounter resistance, then it's information that can allow us to create better change, is really helpful. And I also really like what you said about the linear thing, because very often change in complex systems is cyclic. It's much more like an iterative process. It's a repeated loop. We might expand capacity, or we might change the domain a bit, but it's not like we go here and we're finished. It's part of an ongoing process and a continuing process. And I also think, this idea of change resistance can very often be when there's this idealized kind of promised land that we arrive at, and then it's all perfect. And there's no reality. That doesn't ever reflect reality. That's never going to reflect reality. And so if we can be more truthful, be richer in our understanding of where we're going and what's good and bad about that, we can actually make much more informed decisions and orient much easier towards the good rather than the perfect.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in what you are saying, you are talking about how change shows inequity and how it's never neutral. It benefits some groups while burdening some, sometimes unintentionally, maybe most times unintentionally. Neurodivergent staff, minoritized groups, lower power employees, these bear the hidden costs of change, especially change that's not well thought through. So resistance usually shows where the pain points are or where the unintended harms may lie.
Absolutely. And we see this in change like the return to office stuff.
Yeah.
Where the impact of a return to office is much, much greater on people lower in the organization, usually because they live further away from places, because people who live in the middle of cities tend to be senior in organizations because you need a lot of money to live in the middle of a city. And so the impact of, a quarter of an hour's commute is a very different prospect to an hour and a half's commute.
Yeah.
And so those impacts all definitely line up, and I think that's a really interesting example of how the costs of change and the benefits that accrue from that change can be very disproportionate amongst different people.
Yeah.
So is there any other alternatives if we're not thinking of change resistance as a concept? Is there anything else any other way we can approach some of this stuff?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is stop the paternalism. If change is designed by a few and done to many, most likely there will be resistance and, things may not work as well or as smoothly. There needs to be genuine co-creation for the change to not feel like something that is destabilizing, something that is just done for the sake, especially with people that are neurodivergent or people that see things differently.
And I very often see in change efforts this idea of consultation.
Yes.
What consultation is usually taken to mean is that the people who are the subject of the change don't fully understand why it's really good for them. So if we just explain it to them, they will understand, and then they will be completely happy. And that just like you said, that paternalistic like assumption that change is good for them. We know what's good. We know better what's good for them than they do. So a consultation isn't about an exchange. It's not about understanding other viewpoints. It's about addressing their misconceptions. And I think that's such a different process to what you're talking about. It's not that and I think it's also really important for me to point out that bottom-up processes aren't perfect either and have their own limitations. What we want to do is integrate bottom-up and top-down processes. So we want to integrate stuff from the top. It's important that there is someone looking out for the big picture stuff and moving stuff in the right direction and driving some of this. That's actually an important thing for organizations. But it's got to be with an awareness of what's emerging and what's coming from the whole organization. It's got to be an integrative thing. So if what's happening is you're just, if you're thinking that what a consultation is just explaining change so that people understand and then they will be okay, you could be very, very mistaken.
And what you are saying is the basis of ADCAS model, isn't it? Where the assumption is once we have explained and the people know, then they would want the change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's, there's so much involved in this that's so really fundamental and personal. And it is very individual. And I think we often, there is this big failure in the way we think about business in general and business psychology in general, that separates us, makes us think of ourselves as almost like robots. That we separate emotions, we separate identity from work. Yet work is intensely social. It's intensely located. It's entirely located in meaning and meaning making. And so the idea that change can represent a really significant change of identity, how we see ourselves, and that is a really major thing to foist on someone. And so I think for me, it's thinking about, part of the whole idea of getting beyond the idea of change resistance is just to think about how many domains we're actually creating change in, and think about all of those effects and start working sensitively with them, rather than taking this perspective that we do know, and we can quite clearly plan this out without input from others.
And piggybacking on that point, it would make a lot of sense. Well, in my head, it's making a lot of sense how it would be important, how it would be necessary to respect the expertise of neurodivergent individuals in managing themselves. Ask them what holds them together before pulling their world apart. And the information that is given will prepare them to look at different and alternative ways of building a different world, so that they can stay not necessarily in control, but at least within some limits of control.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you have, sorry, go on. Yeah. So, and when you have a history of failure with change, on your own story, put your hands up, say you have done this and failed in the past, and this is how I am planning to do things differently. This restores trust in people.
That's the big thing. Yeah, trust.
Yeah,
I think that's the key thing. Is if you have change resistance, what you perceive as change resistance means that you're not trusted fully. And if you're not trusted fully and you're a leader, that's on you to address.
Indeed. Yeah. That's
great. So if you in the audience have any questions or any comments, I expect people will have some comments about this, because it's quite an emotive and powerful subject. Please do let us know in the comments, or drop us a message, and we'll address them in future episodes. The next episode we're going to have is on resilience, which is another big topic for me, and another one of those phrases that I think feels very misused to me. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I hope to see you again very soon. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.